When we talk about force plates, we're typically talking about numbers, peak force, power, asymmetry, but those things really only tell us what happened. It's the waveform that tells us how it happened. And how it happened, that's where the athlete's neuromuscular strategy lives. And that's going to be the exact same strategy that we see as coaches every day in clinic or on the gym floor as our athletes cut, move, land, evade, and produce force. Now, long before we're taught how to think about data analytics and curves, we're typically taught how to think about movement. And these are some of the giants whose shoulders that I'm standing on. Without these individuals here, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. They've massively influenced our systems and frameworks at ORKA Performance. You'll see a lot of their research and themes emerge over the next 60 minutes. And some of them have been generous enough to give up some of their time from a mentorship capacity for me. So I just wanted to take a second to give them their props and flowers because of how influential they've been on my career. I also want to give a shout out to one of my clients in particular who's given me the consent and allowed me to use some of her videos and data as a part of the talk, which I think brings a really nice practical flair and allows us to pin some of these kind of high level concepts onto a case study, which hopefully allows you to take a little bit more out of it as you complete these modules and then go back and try to apply it obviously to the athlete or the human in front of you in clinic. Now, with all that said, let's get stuck in. So before we even dive into numbers, I want to start with something a lot simpler, which is coach's eye. Because in rehab, when we're chasing adaptations, being able to identify strategy and different neuromuscular compensatory patterns can be where all the money is for us. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you 3 videos of the exact same task at different time points in the rehab process. No metrics, just our eyes. So we're going to watch this carefully. Without thinking too hard, which video here, which color, do you feel like the athlete uses the cleanest unloading strategy? Just lock that in, red, green, or yellow. What if I ask you which one of these videos does she select the deepest counter movement depth? What would you answer then? Let's lock that in too. Now, if we fast forward into real time, which one of these videos looks like she's using the fastest eccentric peak velocity, or where does she dip into the counter movement jump and commit to that CMJ the quickest? Lock that final answer in, red, green, or yellow. Now, notice how confident you felt. Now imagine 3 clinicians at your clinic give 3 completely different answers. This is where interpretation can start to get a little bit risky, right? Because the video itself can be persuasive, but without layering in some more insights, it likely is just going to remain opinion, right? And if you think of the data and the analytics and the video as the surface, the waveform is going to be the fingerprint of that athlete's movement signature. The video is going to tell us what happened, but it's the waveform and curve that's going to tell us how it happened. And if we don't have some sort of framework for what we're looking for, we're likely all going to see something very different. So in this module, as we go through the process of identifying problems and solutions and addressing the force time curve, we're not going to hunt the best metrics to hang our hat on for ACL rehab or the best tests to do for different types of injuries. We're actually going to hunt patterns, because to truly understand rehab and performance, you need to be able to perceive patterns. And as we rehab more and more ACL athletes, we start to see something very interesting. These athletes are very unique, but the patterns in which they organize themselves into are remarkably consistent. And what evolves over time is not just their output, like power and jump height, but it's also their strategy. And traditionally, when we talk about performance and rehab, we're talking about 2 things. Can the athlete produce force? And can they produce force quickly? And for sure, those questions matter, but they don't really explain how the system is self-organizing to provide a solution for the motor problem or the task that we've given them. To really understand strategy, we need to take a look under the hood, and we have to understand what's driving it, because the exact same output can be produced by very different drivers with very different strategies in two different athletes. By understanding strategy and how those athletes are organizing force over time, we can figure out as practitioners and coaches what levers we need to pull on at what time in the rehab process. And we can really move away from what the numbers are showing to what's driving it and what strategy the athlete's using underneath it, and then ultimately what we're gonna do about it. So this is the approach that we take at ORKA. The first thing that we try to do is we try to identify some problems. We take a look at what's wrong with numbers if we don't provide context to those numbers. Are the numbers actually going to tell us the entire story? What happens if we reduce our interpretation down to just looking at asymmetry? And what about the kinetic chain, proximally and distally to the injury site or the site that's being rehabilitated, especially distally at the foot and ankle, which we'll take a deep dive into throughout this practical. From there, once we identify our problems, we then need to provide some solutions, and that's going to be where our force time curve rules of engagement come in. So looking at the numbers without context, I want to introduce you to a case study. So this is Avery. Avery rehabilitated her left knee with us for 12 months, and in her second match back after that left ACL reco, she takes a red card tackle to the right knee, and just like that, she goes down with another right knee acute injury. Now, naturally, having just done 12 months with us, she's going to try to get back in to see us right away. She trusts us, she went through the process with us, and she's gonna want a diagnosis for that acute injury on the right side. So she comes in to see us, acute knee, big, effused, blown up, and we get her on the table, we do some differential diagnosis, and us as practitioners, we confirm the worst. We suspect that there's a complete ACL rupture on now her other side, her right side, and there could also be some meniscal involvement as well. So what we do for Avery, we send her off to the orthopedic surgeons, they do a consult, they get her into the OR, and they're gonna do an ACL reconstruction with a meniscus repair. And when they go in there, they're gonna do a bone patellar tendon bone graft, so an anterior graft harvest with a bony plug on either side. That'll have some implications when we're taking a look at restoring vertical jumps and some things like deceleration and landings for this athlete, so it's important context to have. So she gets her ACL reco done, bone patellar tendon bone graft with a meniscus repair, and then she's gonna come back into us to rehab now her right knee. She comes to us at a time post-op in 2026 where tech has absolutely exploded, right? Clinicians every day were flooded with data, insights, analytics. And if we haven't adopted tech, we're already behind. But if we have adopted it, well, now the real challenge starts to begin. We're left interpreting 600 different insights from a singular task, right? And that's where it really becomes problematic because we're trying to figure out what actually matters, how to test what matters, and then how to address what matters. And to make things a little bit more difficult for those of us that aren't sports scientists is that we're now faced with metrics with multiple calculation methods. We take something like RSI or jump height. There's multiple different ways to calculate RSI. We're faced with multiple different jump height calculations. Now, imagine we're going to benchmark Avery to the leader in the space at Aspetar, and we have Aspetar saying in a double leg drop jump 1.3 is a good benchmark for competitive athletes as they go back to sport. So we're going to benchmark Avery to that with some context from her sport and her case, but we don't ask ourselves what RSI calculation is Aspetar using. All of a sudden, we actually might be comparing apples to oranges and overshooting our RSI. And then we ask ourselves, are we returning our athlete too quickly, or is she truly benchmarking to that high-level facility that we're using as the gold standard, right? Another problem is that insights in asymmetry are great, but subtle little issues left unchecked can vastly influence the reliability of our data. Take a look at this waveform right here. If you look at vertical force in gray, peak vertical force, you can see these little kind of disturbances or oscillations in the curve, right? What is that? So if we add on right leg, right plate in orange, we don't see anything. We add on blue, left leg, left plate, we start to see those same disturbances. So interestingly, in this situation, we could actually have an unstable plate or unstable surface, right? And now the problem is these subtle little oscillations can affect takeoff or landing events and can contaminate total force during the concentric phase and affect everything from force time to displacement to velocity. 1 foot on each plate, arms by the sides, nice and still. Okay, hands on hips. What about our weighting phase? So if we take a look at the weighting phase, take a look at this example for Avery. Specifically, we'll get some output, we'll get some curves from it, but look at jump height and peak power. You'll see 27 and 46 there in terms of output. Now watch what happens if I go in and edit the recording and bring it from 83 kgs the weight to 82.3, and we'll reanalyze the exact same effort. All of a sudden, jump height jumps up to 29, peak power up to 48. So interestingly here, from a quality assurance perspective, if I'm in the waiting phase before I actually execute the CMJ and Avery's distracted, she's talking to somebody across the gym, maybe she's kind of hand on the hip and she's got more weight on the left side, subtle changes of less than a kilogram can vastly change the output that we're going to get from the exact same effort. So these quality assurance measures, from plates being stable, to taking a look at any quality assurance disturbances on unstable surfaces, to just appropriate weighting, is massively important to make sure that we're making decisions off of reliable and valid numbers and really cutting through the noise. So when we're faced with this many numbers, and a counter movement jump can output 600 different metrics for us, the mistake is actually trying to track more numbers. What we actually need is a way to filter our numbers. So before we interpret anything, we ask 3 really simple questions. Number 1, is this number real, right? Or is the weight off? Is the plate unstable? If there's any quality assurance issues and we feel like there's noise, that might be a scenario where we re-zero the plates, we take some time to check the surface, we wash the rep and retest again, because if the number's not reliable and real, it probably doesn't deserve interpretation, right? Then we look at what's actually producing the output, right? So is it a change in force? Is it a change in impulse? Or did the athlete just change their strategy? And then we look at how it holds up when we stress it. A lot of solutions that the athlete's going to pull on look really good until we change the task. So adding speed, load, fatigue, where does that athlete's strategy break? We're going to come back to this throughout the module, but I just want you to keep this in top of mind as a sort of a filter as to how we're going to filter our metrics as we get them from our tech. Now, if we layer in a little bit more context, and I ask you in this scenario here, which athlete produces more force? We have Avery here in yellow, and we have her teammate in red, right? So think for a second, which athlete here, if you had to say yellow or red, produces more force? Some of you might be thinking red, maybe yellow. Some of you might be like, Trav, listen, I need way more context here. It's a little bit ambiguous, and you'd be right. So a lot of these critical kind of sporting actions, these high intensity actions, they happen in incredibly short time frames in sport. Sport doesn't give us all day to produce force. So if we start to take a look at some of the rate of force development time intervals of sport, and specifically for Avery, we're going to take a look at football, we start to see that if we were to break down the high intensity actions for that sport, we're probably going to take a look at deceleration, cutting and evasion, acceleration, and max velocity. Those might be some of the HIAs that we're interested in. And then if we take a look at some of the rate of force development or time intervals there, we start to see that with deceleration, shallow kind of cuts, 120 to 180. They can, keep top end speed up. Not as many deceleration demands through the anti-penultimate and the penultimate step before they get to final foot contact. But as they go into moderate and sharper cuts, obviously the contact time through final foot contact is going to be a little bit longer, right? And their efficiency is going to dictate that. So if they're really efficient from a deceleration perspective through the anti-penultimate and the penultimate step, as they get into final foot contact, they should be able to sit the center of mass back, and they should be able to, have a lot of their deceleration already taken place through the prior 2 preparatory steps, and that should shorten their contact time. versus if they aren't efficient through the antepenultimate and the penultimate step, as they get into final foot contact, they actually might dip into trunk flexion to deal with those deceleration demands because they haven't picked up much through those prep steps. That might actually increase their contact time, and then they'll get off on their angle, and that could potentially have some performance implications. Right? So as we take a look at these sporting actions, yes, technical competency will dictate time intervals for sure, but these roughly are what we're going to see through deceleration and through cutting. And then if we move towards acceleration and max velocity, early accel 250 to 300 milliseconds, late accel 180 to 220. We know the trunk is going to start to ascend, the tibia is going to start to ascend till the athlete's more vertical as they get towards max velocity shapes. And then at max velocity, we're going to see contacts anywhere from 80 to 120 milliseconds in efficient athletes. So there's the context of time, right? And the context of time within the high intensity actions of sport. So if we go back to our example of the girls, we have Avery and our teammate, and we add on an execution window or time dependency, that vastly changes your interpretation of this situation. If we give the time dependency for the task as 100 milliseconds for that high intensity action, in this situation here, you might now say, okay, Trev, I'm pretty confident now that Red, Avery's teammate, is going to be producing more force, and that actually might have some performance benefits for her given the task that we're talking about. Versus if we switch that execution window to 250 milliseconds, you might now flip-flop your answer and say, well, now Trav, I think Avery here in yellow is producing more force. And that's actually going to have potentially some performance benefits for her given the task that we're talking about in the context of the conversation, right? So therein lies the purpose of applying some context to the case itself. Peak force alone is never going to tell us everything we need in terms of trying to make a decision. It doesn't tell us how quickly the athlete can express that force and if they can express it in the right direction at the right time. Sport lives in milliseconds, so our decisions need to reflect that reality, and we'll always have to layer in that context. Data without context is going to create confidence, but that doesn't mean that we have clarity. We need to understand the task, the time available that the athlete has to express force, and the reliability of our signal. And if our signal is not reliable, we then need to wash that data and likely retest again. Now, do our numbers tell us the entire story? Right? A really good article here by Paul Reed. And Paul took a look at ACL athletes at 2 different time intervals in a single leg drop jump post-op. And what he was taking a look at here was whether or not the athlete was able to improve output. So he's taking a look at things like RSI, jump height, contact time, but he was also taking a look at strategy and evaluating the waveform and the shape of that force time curve. And what he found, interestingly, is during the first single leg drop jump, about 70% of athletes still showed kind of poor stretch shortening cycle utilization. So it looked like the shape of the curve looked like the one here in red. But on follow-ups on that secondary drop jump, the athletes were able to increase their RSI, but 50% of them were still showing poor to moderate stretch shortening cycle waveforms. So red and yellow. And I think we see that all the time if we analyze our data that we have for our athletes, and as we start to treat more and more of these ACLs as they come through, and some similar parallels to other injuries as well, we see these trends where on longitudinal follow-ups, we'll see increases in trajectory of output. Could be jump height, peak power, RSI, and the drop jump. But the strategy that the athlete's using varies significantly as they go through the process. So I think what Paul's article sheds light on is that RSI alone is insufficient as a return to sport readiness metric. Improvements in RSI might not necessarily reflect improvements in stretch shortening cycle function, and that persistent stretch shortening cycle deficit could suggest incomplete restoration of neuromuscular function and may, in the context of the case, lead to that athlete inheriting an increased re-injury risk. Right? So what we want to see as we go through the process here is typically our initial drop jump in ACLs is around month 4 or 5 for our athletes. And the very first drop jump we see, we're typically going to see this big peak impact force in the first 20% of ground contact. So what that typically derives from is the athlete can't really balance passive and active deceleration. Right? So what we end up getting is this big impulse deficit. We have a passive landing strategy, not a lot of active deceleration. They're typically restoring still, eccentric quadricep strength, force output. They're just overcoming some AMI or some arthrogenic muscle inhibition. And we get this inefficient transition between the eccentric phase as they absorb on the plates and the concentric phase as they try to transfer between those two and go into propulsion. The large impact peak, that rapid force spike following the contact, so they kind of hit the plates, they just get slammed with force, and their ground contact times are quite long. So if you take a look here at the bottom between the two vertical lines, that time, that's ground contact time. And as they get more efficient and you look at kind of that U shape, you'll see the U gets a lot more narrow. That's the athlete shortening their ground contact time. So what we'll see early on is ground contact times that kind of sit around 250 milliseconds or above. And really, it's just inefficient stretch shortening cycle ability. And that big jagged peak with the U shape and gutter that we call contact trough, that's lost impulse. Okay, so that potentially could be impulse that could have been transferred into output, but they're just not efficient with the way that they're, again, balancing passive landing and active deceleration. And what we want to see as we bring our athletes through the rehab process, if we're giving them the right stimulus, they're getting the adaptations and they're improving stretch shortening cycle function, is we actually want to see this impulse deficit recovery month over month. So what we see here at month 6 and month 8 is that we see a reduced peak impact force within that first 20% of ground contact. So that big kind of initial peak impact spike starts to reduce. We start to see improved recovery of active deceleration. So probably a little bit better balance between passive landing and active deceleration. And we see ground contact time at the bottom between those two vertical poles starts to shorten, right? So reflective of just improvements and faster stretch shortening cycle activity. And at month 8, it really starts to resemble this inverted U shape, where we see this increased rate of rise with reduced impact peaks, quality deceleration after ground contact, and our ground contact times get under 250 milliseconds and approach 200 milliseconds if they're really showing quality stretch shortening cycle utilization. So here's kind of a little bit of an overview where we have the exact same task, different efforts, different time points, vastly different shapes. Right? So improving a number doesn't guarantee that we're actually improving the athlete unless we actually understand how the output was produced. So context to numbers are key, and the numbers alone aren't going to tell us the entire story. We're going to have to interpret what's driving the output and also what strategy the athlete's going to utilize. And being able to interpret these waveforms and curves is one of the best ways to be able to interpret strategy. Now in rehab and performance, a lot of the old research just takes a look at this arbitrary 10% cutoff, and there's a lot of conversation around asymmetry. But we're going to challenge that a little bit through this module and say, well, what are potentially some problems if we reduce our interpretation down to only looking at asymmetry? Right? I think it's really simplistic to take the approach where symmetry is good, asymmetry is bad. But that's likely oversimplified and providing too simple of an answer to a very complex organism like an athlete or a human being. When we bring athletes through and we take a look at asymmetry specifically, there's typically 4 different archetypes that we see come through our clinic. And for sure, as we bring the athlete through vertical jump testing, could be a drop jump, could be a counter movement jump, as we take a look at the different phases, we take a look at braking and deceleration, amortization, that transfer between the two, and then the different concentric phases, flight and landing, we're for sure going to see asymmetries that rear their heads. So if we take a look at this waveform here for Avery, we see her right leg, which is her operative leg, is in orange. And we can see through unloading and deceleration, the blue force time trace is her left leg, orange is her right leg. We can see just the trajectories are a little bit different between her operative side and her uninvolved side. Right? But if we bucket the athletes and we take a look and analyze what we're seeing from an asymmetry perspective, we'll typically see this. We'll see asymmetrical and weak, where these athletes have fairly high levels of asymmetry. And when we compare them to their peers, they test fairly low. Then we have symmetrical and weak, where these athletes have fairly low levels of asymmetry. It's approaching that kind of arbitrary 10% cutoff. But when we benchmark them to their peers, they also test very low. We have asymmetrical and strong, where the athletes might have high levels of asymmetry And when we benchmark them to their peers, they actually benchmark fairly high. And then we might have symmetrical and strong, where when we take a look at that 10% cutoff, they're approaching that or maybe underneath that. And when we benchmark them to their peers, they also test very high. So when we consider these different phenotypes and archetypes and all the variability between what we need to see, it definitely can create some challenges. And if we take a look at some of the recent work by Afonso and his colleagues, he highlighted that asymmetries of 5 to 15% or even higher are often common and potentially not harmful. And athletes can actually improve performance while maintaining asymmetries of up to 30%. So if we take that 10% cutoff, that can mean two completely different things. We could have two very strong limbs or two very weak limbs. And without raw data, the percentage alone can be a little bit misleading. So we're always going to want to layer in some strength context and not just take a look at that ratio itself. So what do? Well, we don't rely on a single test. We know that asymmetries are task, metric, and direction specific, which means what we see in a unilateral jump might show completely differently in an isokinetic test or an isometric dynamometry test or horizontal hop. So we're going to want to layer in multiple tests to get context. However, there's a caveat to that. We really have to balance that as we layer in more tests, the probability of the athlete failing a test by chance alone starts to increase with every test that we add to the battery. So again, we want to take the concept of those high intensity actions, and that's going to dictate what tests we do. We never want to have a cookie cutter protocol of tests. We're going to consider the tasks of sport and all the different qualities that are required to execute that task at a high level. And that's going to dictate what jumps or what tests we do for the athlete. Okay, we're not going to select tests for no reason. Every test that we perform for an athlete will serve a purpose and likely link to one of their high intensity actions. One test is always going to give us a really narrow and incomplete picture. Performance context is always going to matter. And we really, as practitioners, should be prioritizing the development of two high functioning limbs as opposed to two symmetrical limbs as we bring them through the rehabilitative process, right? And we want to really make sure that we're monitoring limb performance longitudinally over time. Repeated assessments are always going to be more reliable than one time interval or one time point. If this individual here just had a terrible testing session, they didn't sleep well last night, maybe they broke up with their partner, maybe there's different stresses going on at school or something like that, that time frame that we're judging might not be necessarily reflective of their current state. The way we cut through the noise with that is with repetitive longitudinal testing, and then we can really get an average and an accurate coefficient of variation and make sure that we're able to select metrics that are reliable to make decisions off of. So we're going to measure outputs, we're going to note asymmetry, but we're going to be wary of fixed thresholds. Asymmetry without strength and task context can really misrepresent limb function. So we have to be a little bit cautious there. The final problem that we can run into is just taking a look at the kinetic chain. Specifically, what happens if we ignore the foot and ankle as a driver? We understand now that we got to provide some context to our numbers. We need to make sure we're getting reliable numbers to make decisions off of. They're not going to tell us the entire story. We need to be able to interpret the waveform. And asymmetry and fixed thresholds and ratios, we need to be wary of just utilizing those in our interpretation. But if we take a look at the foot and ankle, there's been some really good research done by Enda and his colleague Chris Richter, where they were taking a look at plyometric ability being one of the most important predictors as to who goes on to re-rupture the contralateral limb and who doesn't. And it makes sense, right? Plyometric drills by nature require a lot of horizontal and vertical ankle stiffness from the gastrocsoleus muscle. If we take a look at just the kinematics of some of these vertical positions and vertical tasks, the inability to control dorsiflexion seems to be quite detrimental to the amount of tibial excursion and the amount of control of tibial translation the athlete has. So in ACL rehab, we're obviously going to spend a lot of time restoring mass, overcoming arthrogenic muscle inhibition within the anterior kind of quadricep region and thigh. But if we take a look at this article by Kip and Kim, I think it highlights some very interesting trends. So as we look at the different phases here, take a look at what themes start to emerge. She goes through amortization into that start of propulsion, or the P1 concentric phase. She goes through the last 50% of propulsion, P2, and goes into flight. What do we see continuously come up? It's the contributions of Soleus, but also Gastroc as we approach toe-off, and their contribution through that task itself is very, very high, right? And that's not just vertical jumps. This plays a massive role, obviously, within the high-intensity actions of sport as well. So as we move through ACL rehab and these high-intensity actions, we're gonna see these distal themes emerge time and time again. Let's go back to those high-intensity actions for Avery that we talked about earlier. We said deceleration, cutting evasion, acceleration, max velocity. If we take a more magnified look distal to the knee, we're gonna start to see these foot and ankle themes start to emerge, right? The ability to actively dorsiflex through flight, create this pre-activation, dorsiflexion, pre-tension, what's happening through the penultimate step, center of pressure in through the foot. There's massive implications distally to the foot and ankle complex on how the athlete's gonna execute not just the tests that we do, like our CMJs and drop jumps, but also the high intensity actions as well. If you take a look at some of Damien Harper's research in the deceleration space, during that first phase of deceleration, there's a very big hip extension moment. But as we get into phases 2 and 3, there's large knee and ankle moments. And while we have huge eccentric demands of the hip extensors and the quadriceps, we also see big eccentric demands of the anterior and posterior shank, with tibialis anterior and soleus as well. If you take now a more distal approach and look at the foot, Romain has some brilliant research here taking a look at the foot and ankle complex and also the metatarsophalangeal joint and how it relates to high intensity actions of sport. So if you take a look at some of Romain's research, he was taking a look at metatarsophalangeal flexion strength and the role it's going to play in propulsion and force transmission. We're going to jump in 3, 2, 1. So if you take a look at something like a counter movement jump, that rear foot is going to be our absorber. The midfoot is going to be our absorber and lever. And then the forefoot is going to be our propeller. And if you take a look at some of the outputs of his research, what Romain found was that through something like cutting, improvements in metatarsophalangeal flexion torque led to increased 90-degree cut times and improved medial lateral ground reaction force control and ratios. In things like max velocity running, there was improved vertical impulse and improved contact times or shorter ground contact times. And in horizontal jumping, there was improvements in concentric impulse and increased jump distance. So what that means for us is the foot and ankle isn't just a passenger or a supporting player. It's actually a critical anchor, not just to the tests that our athletes have to pass, but to the high intensity actions of sport as well. And if we neglect them early, they're gonna show up later on as we bring our athletes through the rehab process, start to test them and get them back onto the court, field, ice, or whatever their sport may be. So if we take a step back and we take a look at Avery's journey, the problem was never that we didn't have enough data or insights. The problem was really that at different time intervals in her rehab process, the exact same numbers could actually mean completely different things because the strategy underneath them is continuously changing. So if we want to know if she's truly getting adaptations, we need a very clear way to interpret strategy through the curve and through the waveform. And this is going to be where our force time curve rules of engagement come in. So if we take a look at first providing some cohesion and context to these problems that we encountered, when we talk about numbers that don't have context, what we're really talking about is inconsistency. And anytime humans want to create consistent outcomes, we typically build a system. Walt Disney figured this out really early on. He didn't just build one good movie. He actually built a way to build good movies over and over again. And through this document that he called The Hero's Journey, it was all about structure. This repeatable sequence that made sense of these complex stories. And the system was more important than any one scene in the movie. And once this system existed, the outcomes could really start to multiply. Different characters, different worlds, completely same underlying structure. Without systems, all of our numbers are going to start to drift without context, But in rehab and performance, especially in the private sector where we're trying to create cohesion across maybe a large group of practitioners, the systems is going to be what makes our data and our insights and our outcomes interpretable. So we want to make sure as we endeavor to create cohesion at ORKA that we're actually comparing apples to apples. So the very first thing we need to appreciate is that when we take a look at our database, we have physiotherapists, strength coaches, physicians, we have interns that are coming through our facility on the physio side and the strength and conditioning side. We don't have a sports scientist. It's not super common to have a sports scientist in private practice in Canada. So as you can imagine, the testing chaos can become real, right? So as we take a look at creating cohesion, the first thing we need is some standards around the temporal nature of testing, the frequency that we're going to test. Right? So it might be a little bit different on the performance side, but typically on the rehab side, we'll test an athlete, we'll alter the programming variables. They'll go on a mesocycle or a block of programming for anywhere between 4 to 5 weeks. And then we'll retest again to see if that athlete's gotten the adaptations that we set out to get at the beginning of the block. And then we'll alter programming variables accordingly. We might have to rinse and repeat that max strength focus, or we might be able to move into some more speed strength work and some more dynamic kind of efforts, depending on whether or not the stimulus has achieved what we set out to achieve. Okay. From a performance standpoint, they might program for 5-6 weeks, depending on the athlete and the context of the case. But that's typically our testing cadence for us at ORKA. Now, at ORKA, we really try to resist the feeling that we need to give an individual new exercises every time they see us in clinic. I think in private practice, we kind of get caught in this dichotomy where we feel like if we don't provide a new exercise every time somebody comes in, they haven't gotten value from the session. But they're not paying you for new exercises. They're paying you for an outcome. And there's certain cases where giving them a progression is not going to get them to their outcome any quicker. Conversely, it actually might take them longer if it flares them up and they weren't ready for it. There's some cases where rinse and repeating the exact same block or drill, or creating this lateralization or regression if it doesn't look good, is actually a quicker way to the finish line for them than giving them a new drill every time they come in. It's really the outcome that's going to make them go spread word of mouth and tell everybody either about your brand or about you as a practitioner, and that's going to lead to acquisition on the backside with new clients come in and make you busier, which gives you a new opportunity to create more outcomes, but also from a monetary standpoint is going to help if you're in private practice because you're not going to be wondering about these gaps in your day. So service the outcome. Don't service this internal imposter syndrome where you feel like you're not giving value if you're not doing needling, or if you're not doing manipulations, or if you're not giving new drills every time or new programs. Get the adaptations that you need. Allow testing to serve whether or not you've gotten those adaptations. Give them a new stimulus once they've gotten the adaptations. Rinse and repeat that throughout the rehab process. Keep the joint that you're rehabbing calm. Get to the outcome as quickly as you can with primary tissue healing in the back of mind, so as safely as you can. That's going to be really what improves your stock and makes you the go-to practitioner in your given city for whatever demographic that you're seeing. So again, we'll program for 4 to 5 weeks. We'll retest the athlete. Depending on whether or not they've gotten the adaptations, that'll dictate if we're going to give them a new stimulus. We'll move them through different focuses, whether it be strength endurance, hypertrophy, max strength, speed strength, move them along that control chaos continuum as they go throughout that rehab macro cycle. The next thing that's really important is how we organize our database. So at ORKA, when an athlete comes in and they're going to have a new assessment, our athlete experience admin sets up their VALD profile. That includes name, date of birth, gender, email. An external ID is where they put the practitioner or physio's name. That allows us to run some analytics and take a look at how certain physios are restoring certain qualities, who our strongest physios may be at restoring RSI or stretch shortening cycle capabilities. Is anybody lagging behind? That then feeds into potentially some mentorship conversations and things like that. And then we're going to add them to a category and a group. And that allows us to make sure that we can stratify and run some analyses on our data. Because we realized really early on that we can benchmark to these numbers that elite institute, national institutes of sports are putting out, or Aspetar, but we don't have the same demographic as Aspetar. Our average age group in through ORKA is the 14 to 17-year-old female soccer player, or the 18 to 22-year-old collegiate player, hockey or snow sports. We have a very different demographic than some of these institutes that we in the past have benchmarked to. So although we'll still use them, and they are the gold standard and they're doing brilliant work, now that we have over 5,000 data points in our ACL database, we're also interested into what our trends are, right? What are our averages? What's our upper levels, our 75th and lower level 25th percentiles? What's our median RSI or eccentric deceleration for some of these metrics? And are we actually as good as what we think we are at restoring certain qualities? Right? So when we're organized, we can start to get lots of different insights. And here's an example with our surgical athletes, our females, where we take a look at eccentric deceleration impulse adjusted for body mass. And we can start to see some of our trends here. And orange is our 50th percentile. And that's month over month as they go from month 3, 6, 9, and 12. The other things we can do from a business lens is we can start to take a look at our different programs or our ecosystem and how successful different arms of our ecosystem are at actually getting outcomes and adaptations. So here's an example here of our females who are on rehab membership, which is our subscription program. They pay one price for the week. They get an on-table session with their physiotherapist, and they get access to rehab runs and rehab gyms, which they'll come in with their individualized program, but they're coached by a physiotherapist in that session. Allows us to really progress, regress, create lateralizations week over week, give lots of kind of dialed in coaching cues. And naturally, with that exposure 4 to 5 times a week as opposed to 1 to 2 or maybe once, those athletes who are in more frequently, more frequent stimulus, probably quicker adaptations, don't have to wait 7 days till they see their physio again to have something regressed or progress. We've all had the client where a drill didn't feel right or was maybe hurting, so they just stop doing that until they see you again. But in the moment now, in the week, our physios can actually progress and regress things and make sure those athletes don't skip a beat. And you can see here in black, just the rate, like especially at month 6, those two different programs, subscription versus just session by session follow-up, really start to diverge, right? And we do see now from an outcome perspective, our athletes who are on subscription do restore qualities at a higher rate. And now when we're doing discovery calls from a business standpoint, it becomes less about a business pitch or a sales pitch. It's all outcome focused for us. And we can show this graph and say, listen, these are our programs. This is why we're suggesting this one. It's not a monetary thing. It's an outcome thing. And we do find that our athletes get better adaptations. These are the price points. And then we have the conversation on whether or not that's feasible for the family or the individual, and we go from there. Now, when a new practitioner comes into our ecosystem, a lot of physios now in 2026 know what technology is. I think when we first started out in ORKA's inception, a lot of people didn't know what force plates or dynamometers were, especially in the rehab space. They just had no introduction to them at all. I know I didn't. And I really found out quickly how big my blind spots were 4 years ago when we got the force frame from Vald, and I realized I didn't know what my business partner was talking about when he said rate of force development, or I didn't know what speed strength was, or I couldn't even tell you what was on the force velocity curve just because our institutions didn't prepare us for it. So when somebody comes in now in 2026, they kind of have an idea what some of this stuff is, which is brilliant. But again, that's only a piece of the puzzle. How this stuff is utilized and the clinical reasoning that goes behind it really makes clinics and clinicians either dangerous and an absolute weapon, or it can create a lot of confusion and chaos, not just for the clinician, but also for the individual who's trying to make sense of all these numbers if we're not able to create vision for them. So when an individual comes into our ecosystem now to help them out, we'll give them this document, we'll sit them down, we'll help set up the results page on the Vald Hub so that we have metrics in there that are reliable, we can make sound decisions off of, they have reasonable coefficients of variation, they cut through the noise, and they have almost a base template of what to look at in there, and they're not left with either the pre-populated metrics that are in there when you first get access to the hub, or they're left trying to sort out which ones they're going to look at and add in. And then we can start to do some education on what each metrics mean and also the overlap between the metrics, because what a lot of people are starting to understand is that, a lot of metrics are derived from the same qualities and calculations. So we can make it more confusing than it needs to be. There's certain ones that I think we can hang our hats on as we go through the process, and certain ones that they're a little bit more reliable and sensitive than others. So once we have that set metrics, now we need standards. We need testing standards, and we need this across all tests. Doesn't matter if it's a neuromuscular control test, functional testing, strength, vertical jumps. If we do a test at ORKA Performance, we have a clinic-wide standard for that test. It could look something like this, where we have quality assurance standards, what type of warm-up they're doing beforehand, are we zeroing the plates, how are we taking our body weight? We saw earlier what just changes in body weight of less than a kilogram can do for our output. Testing protocols, are we hands on the hips or hands by the side? How many reps are we doing? What's the rest between reps? What's our cue? What are we using to validate the tests? All these things are at play. And I think even from a weighting standpoint, you'll see in our videos on social media, we have these ORKA O's in the middle of the plates. That's so our athletes know where to keep their feet equal distance from the midline, and they can reset their foot position every rep to make sure that we're equally loading those load cells and we're getting good distribution, equal distribution, and consistency, or as much consistency as we can as they go through the process. And then when it comes down to cueing, there's been a lot of research in this space that shows that we can actually influence metrics based on the cues that we give. And we can not only influence metrics, but we can bias the athlete to using more of a foot and ankle strategy or more of a shared kind of strategy between the knee and the foot and ankle and the lower kinetic chain. So I need to make sure that if I'm away on holiday and somebody's doing a counter movement jump for my athlete, if they've had an improvement in jump height or peak power, it's not that my colleague just used a completely different cue. We're working off of base set and standard cues so that we can compare apples to apples. And we have base cues for every type of jump or test that we would use. And that goes as far as our strength tests as well. If we're doing something like isometric dynamometry, we'll have a cue for as hard as you can to look at max force or peak force. And then we'll have a cue for as hard and as fast as you can if we're going to take a look at RFD. And we won't compare RFD and peak force within the same rep. We'll actually have a rep for peak force and then a rep for RFD, because the cues are going to be very different. And that doesn't take away autonomy from our practitioners. There's certain cases where we may want to play around with different cues to see what works for an athlete if we're trying to bring certain strategies to the surface. All we do then is we just tag it as an alternate cue. And that way, when we're taking a look at our database, if we have 5 efforts and one we've changed the cue around a little bit, we can filter out that noise and filter out that data if we're running analysis so that we're not influencing the numbers and we're not getting all these outliers when we take a look at our database. All of these systems, functional testing, strength, vertical jumps, they lay in 2 different places. They lay on a small little ring card with a photo of the test, and that's on each device. The Nord board, the force frame tests are all together, force plate tests are all together, the smart speed tests are all together. And then we have a booklet of systems that sits in the sports science area. And this is just a physical hard copy booklet that the practitioners can kind of flip through if they want to reference any of the quality assurance protocols or the cues or the standards. They also have obviously online copies as well that they'll put in on their computers, but they have multiple points of reference. And then this is reinforced through roundtables and technical clinics where we can take the draft of these standards, absolutely tear it down as a unit, and then build it back up and make sure that our team as a whole is happy with the quality of the final product. And this is really how we get commitment and adherence. When we're looking as an organization to get buy-in, my clinicians trust me. If I bring standards to them, they have a pretty good idea that I've heavily researched kind of the why behind everything from quality assurance to the Q, X, Y, and Z. But if we don't give them a voice and allow them to provide some input, what we're likely going to get is compliance. And with compliance, it's really hard to get buy-in. To get buy-in, we need trust and we need commitment. And to get commitment, we need to give our clinicians a voice. So we're always bringing a draft to the clinicians, and as a group, we're then going to poke holes at it and see what needs to be changed before we put out the final product. And once we have this final product and we're going to make this major change across an organization. We'll have this live on Google Classrooms, and we'll say, upcoming major change, testing standards, this is the change we're making, this is why we're making it, this is what happens if we don't make it. And then that lives up there with the PDF document and a little video from their leader, the head of physiotherapy at whatever location, just letting them know that these are the changes that are being made, this is the date that we're changing them, this is why, etc., etc. Okay, so multiple different touch points of access for our clinicians there. So as you can see, as we go to create cohesion and context, it's quality data that's going to be way more beneficial to our organization than having more data. Standards are going to create cohesion. Cohesion creates context. Organized and consistent data is going to be what's the most interpretable. Now, we talked earlier about the same output being produced by very different drivers and very different strategies in different athletes. So anytime we get data, we're going to take a look at this model. We're going to have our outcome. Then we're going to look at what's influencing that outcome and what the strategy is that the athlete has chosen, or what solution they've chosen for the movement problem that we've given them. So it might look something like this. For the counter movement jump, we typically use jump height and peak power. Athletes understand that. I jumped higher, I became more powerful. It's easy to create vision with. And we have some influences. We have things like force, phase-specific impulse, force at zero velocity, or how they're transferring force through that eccentric and concentric phase, power. All these things could influence and change the outcome, but so can the strategy. Durations, eccentric and concentric, or that contraction time. Increases or decreases in that contraction time can vastly influence outcome. The impulse ratios, eccentric peak velocity, or how that athlete attacks that jump, or something like counter movement depth and the depth that they select can all influence the outcome. So when we're looking to improve output, we're making sure that we didn't mask unchanged or even suboptimal physical qualities. Context is always going to matter. And before we pat ourselves on the back for an improvement in output, we're going to take a look at what's driving that and also the strategy that the athlete utilized to achieve that output. Now, these drivers don't really exist in isolation. ACL athletes organize into patterns, as we discussed, and there's certain curve shapes and waveforms that are going to show up repeatedly through the ACL process. And if we want to understand where things are happening, firstly, we have to turn to our phases. So as we bring our athlete Avery through this counter movement jump, we're going to get a waveform that takes place. And we can take a look at force time, or we can take a look at some of the other ones, but we'll start to get a curve. And when we zone into the different aspects of the curve, there's certain time intervals that we're going to take a look at for her. We're going to take a look at unloading, braking, the concentric phases, flight, landing. Once we understand that timeline, we can start to recognize the patterns that are inside it. And the key phases are going to direct our attention to different ranges of motion, different strategic solutions that the athlete might be pulling on. And at a really high level, it's important to understand that these time intervals or these phases are made up of different subcomponents. So for example, the eccentric phase is built from unloading and braking. Braking is built from yielding and decel. The concentric phase has a couple of different components to it. And then there's flight and landing. Okay? But as we introduce ourselves as practitioners to analyzing strategy through curves and waveforms, reducing your interpretation down to just looking at force time is going to be where 90% of what we need is from a rehab and performance lens. Okay, so if you, within the next 12 months, can get really comfortable analyzing and knowing where you're looking at with the counter movement jump and the drop jump, and just looking at force time, you're going to notice a massive difference in the way that you're interpreting the context of your cases for your athletes or your clients that come through. Once you understand that, for sure you can get a little bit more granular and start to take a look at the power curve, displacement, velocity, and things of that nature. But again, force time is going to be where 90% of what you need lies. So I would start at that aspect. So when it comes to force time curve characteristics, there's going to be these repeatable themes or phenotypes that start to come up. And these phenotypes really are meant to reduce the noise. They're not meant as a protocol or to replace clinical reasoning. Right? So we're going to take a look at the shallow end, the jackhammer, the broken bridge, and fail to launch. So when we take a look at the shallow end, What we end up getting here is early on during our first counter movement jump, we get an athlete who's very hesitant, right? So let's call this, for a counter movement jump, month 3 or 4 post-op ACL. We're gonna get that athlete who just avoids depth and just kind of skims the surface. They're not going down very deep as they commit to that counter movement. It's probably a little bit slower than what we're gonna see at mid and end stage for them. And what we end up getting is this really shallow unweighting phase. Super common with athletes with really poor deceleration ability, because that large unweighting phase requires a large amount of impulse to decelerate and redirect momentum. Whereas at return to play, here on the right, we get this quick, large unweighting impulse, which allows the athlete to achieve a really fast eccentric peak velocity. So if we redirect our attention to number 1 here, on the left, you'll see a very small unweighting impulse. There's no real like U shape that comes up, whereas on the right, we see that nice big U shape as the athlete commits to the unweighting process. And again, that allows them to achieve a really fast eccentric peak velocity. And that high eccentric peak velocity sets them up really well for the high amounts of braking and RFD requirements that they might encounter later on down the track. Then we have the jackhammer. So what we end up with is, on the left, during that first CMJ, we get really small braking forces and rate of force development. So after that minimal unweighting, we get an athlete who demonstrates just really poor neuromuscular braking capacity, and they just don't have the ability to decelerate their momentum effectively. They have a really long eccentric duration because it takes them so long to decelerate their momentum. And it's not a very steep slope. It's a really long, elongated, kind of gradual slope as they go to decelerate. Versus on the right at return to sport, after that big unweighting impulse and that commitment through that fast eccentric peak velocity, we see large braking forces and rate of force development, and the athlete is really able to decelerate their momentum effectively by producing these really large, rapid eccentric forces in very short time frames. So we'll start to see the eccentric duration shorten. Then we see the broken bridge. So this is really the connection between loading and unloading and where things start to collapse, and we start to lose energy in our initial kind of early counter movement jumps that we do. So again, for that athlete on the left, kind of low unweighting impulse, lack of commitment, really shaky, poor neuromuscular deceleration abilities, and then we end up getting this really poor eccentric to concentric transfer. There's low eccentric peak forces. It leads to this over-reliance on the concentric phase. Because they can't store a lot of elastic energy as they decel, they need to get some from propulsion, or their output in jump height is going to be really low. Because of their inefficiency through decel, they over-rely on the concentric phase, and that actually might bring some concentric asymmetries to the surface, or some different strategies through that concentric phase. So I always challenge therapists to, if you see big asymmetries at P1 or P2, ask yourself, what's happening in the preceding phase? So at P2, right at toe off and takeoff, well, what's happened through P1 as they went through the first 50% of the concentric phase? Or in P1, what's happened through amortization, through that kind of depth of the squat through eccentric and concentric transfer? At amortization, where they're supposed to kind of, they're at zero velocity and they're transferring into propulsion, so they're basically stopped at the bottom of the squat. If there's big issues at amortization or force at zero velocity, what's happened beforehand through decel and through that braking phase, right? So you're always kind of reverse engineering the curve and seeing what's gone on before. Okay, so here, just really poor on the left, eccentric to concentric transfer. It typically leads to an over-reliance on the concentric phase. Versus on the right, we get those high eccentric peak forces. It leads to good energy storage. We have this very effective transfer to propulsive forces, which is delivered by the stretch shortening cycle. And that ends up benefiting that athlete through the concentric phase. And the final one that we get is fail to launch. For that athlete at that time, all systems are a go, but there's nothing that takes off. I compare it to a Ferrari. She's gonna slam the gas, try to go 0 to 60, but we have a dead battery. There's just gonna be no output there for her, and she's just gonna kind of get to a quiet stall. Jump height and peak power are gonna be fairly low, right? What we end up with is lower amounts of neck concentric impulse and lower jump heights for that athlete. Versus on the right, because of the way that they've stored that elastic energy and transferred to the concentric phase by the stretch shortening cycle, we get greater amounts of neck concentric impulse, and that leads to greater jump heights. So each test over the course of the rehab and performance continuum is going to tell us a different part of the story. And what these phenotypes really show us is by influencing the athlete's strategy, now we can start to influence the cost of the task to that system and that complex organism, which is the athlete or the client. And if we can minimize the cost, now we can potentially have some performance implications that are going to benefit them when they get back to those high intensity actions, right? So output might improve, but did that athlete's strategy change? True adaptations are really going to change the shape of the curve, and there's going to be key emerging shapes and themes that we see as the athlete goes through that rehabilitation process. Now, we understand that we can organize our athletes now into these different archetypes or phenotypes, and they're going to show us kind of consistent trends as they go through the process. So our next question is obviously very simple. Well, how do we actually change the curve then, or how do we influence the curve? This is where reverse engineering really begins. And this process that I'm about to show is what goes on in our head most of the time. We're just going to put it on paper from a visual standpoint. Less me having the TV in front of you for feedback and more just seeing where we're at. Okay, because we have those pre-op numbers. You ready? Okay, so go ahead with a rep. So after we've secured some of our early non-negotiables, then we'll start to get into testing the explosiveness and the reactive strength continuum. So for me, I'm gonna make sure that quiet standing looks good early in the process. The force plates aren't something that I get my athlete on at mid-stage. They're on it acutely as early as week 1. Quiet standing at 0, 30, 60, and 90. Usually we'll see these kind of neuromuscular deficits at 90 degrees in quiet standing where they're just holding an isometric squat. I want that to look good. As 90 degrees looks good in quiet standing, I'll add in a double leg squat test or squat assessment. And as the squat assessment looks good, we now can start to look at land and holds, double leg, which is kind of like an altitude drop. And then we can look at the counter movement jump. So everything kind of has a foundational pillar building up to the CMJ. Single leg CMJ is no different, right? So we want to be able to be competent with single leg balance, then single leg squat assessment, then move into single leg altitude drops or land and holds, and then a single leg CMJ. From a reactive strength perspective, if we're taking a look at something like a drop jump, we've probably done some pogos. They might even be efficient with just calf raises to a metronome at 120 or 150 beats per minute, whatever is going to give us kind of that same tempo or that temporal nature to a fast stretch shortening cycle task. And they got to be able to, with the calf pulses, keep their knees locked out in extension. If their knees are buckling and they don't have that inner range quadricep strength, they're probably not ready for something like a pogo, where the standards would be that they're keeping their knees in extension. Right? Same thing with the drop jump. There's going to be some precursors or foundational pillars that we build up to. And Aspetar has some really good entry criteria for when we would start this stuff. So you take a look at eccentric deceleration. We're going to start double leg drills when they have no pain, no swelling, 120 degrees of knee flexion, full extension, and they have a really good front squat to 90 degrees. Concentric propulsion. We'll start double leg drills when they've begun single leg landings. So they've started on some single leg tall shorts. And they've done some concentric efforts, whether it's single leg press, whether it's front squat, or whether it's knee extensions, but they've created a little bit of increased velocity there, and the joint that's in question is staying quiet and calm. Then we'll start to enter into those early kind of levels of our plyometric continuum. Our first counter movement jump is not on the plates. Our first counter movement jump is usually ground-based. The athlete's going to be tentative. And it's not really about data and analytics. For the most part, we know what we're going to see on the first counter movement jump that we do with an athlete. It's not going to look like it does at return to sport, nor are we making a return to sport decision at that time. So we get the athlete comfortable with the task itself. We might coach them through it a little bit. Once we feel like the athlete's comfortable with those ground-based efforts, we'll get them on dual force plates and we'll start to gain some data and insights and see how that's going to influence our programming variables and the stimulus that we provide them with their programming. And we know that there's going to be multiple things that affect this jump. Eccentric quad strength, range of motion, not just at the knee, but distally at the foot and ankle, what's going on through the kinetic chain, how they've overcome inhibition through weeks 8 to 12. All of that is going to influence what we see from an output and a strategy perspective on that initial jump. So the reverse engineering pyramid or framework that we use is typically we'll take the test and there's going to be some performance determinants that's going to dictate how that test goes. So in this case, not an exhaustive list, but we have mobility, motor control and coordination, and neuromuscular strategy. If we zone in on mobility, there's going to be some underlying contributors there that are going to dictate whether or not mobility is advantageous or disadvantageous to the athlete, right? So if we take a look at knee flexion, athlete's knee flexion, terminal knee extension, tibial rotation, all could influence the mobility and influence the test. And we also looked at in some of these vertical jumps what's happening distally at the foot and ankle. So as the athlete goes into amortization or the bottom and absorbs, there needs to be pronation and absorption through the rear foot and the midfoot. That goes with dorsiflexion and tibial IR. And then the knee's going to go into flexion. And as they go into propulsion and create that rigid lever, we're going to see propulsion coming from the forefoot. We're going to see supination, external rotation of the tibia and knee extension. So there's this coupling pattern that needs to happen in through the lower limb. And all of those things there could either influence braking deficits or they could influence propulsive deficits. For each one of those contributors, we're going to want to have some subsets of confirmatory tests to dictate to us whether or not we need to address that. So if we take something like knee flexion, we might have patellar mobility. We might take a look at knee flexion ROM. Might take a look at a fusion because we know a big fused knee with a 2+, 3+, as they go down into deep flexion, there's congestion from an intra-articular standpoint, so they're going to try to probably avoid depth if that's the case. That's going to tell us whether or not that's something that needs to be addressed. For something like the foot and ankle complex, Romain has brilliant work where he's reverse engineering a weight-bearing lunge test, and we might do something like a weight-bearing lunge. If that's restricted on that side, we might get them into a posterior talar glide on the table. That'll dictate to us whether or not we want to deal with midfoot or talar curl joint, right? So if the posterior talar glide is also restricted, we're probably going to do some technical interventions for the talar curl joint. If it's not, we might address the mid-tarsals. If we put that first ray into dorsiflexion and do the weight-bearing lunge test, and that's more restricted, we might have to deal with some chronic stretching for FHL. If we add in inversion and plantar flexion and do a weight-bearing lunge test on a bit of a slant board, and that's affected, we might take a look at the peronei. We also could do a slump test and take a look at whether or not the tibial nerve is involved in that process, depending on where they're feeling the restriction. So we can have these reverse engineering processes that we have in place to dictate what techniques we want to pull on. Terminal knee extension, we might look at things like quads lag, maybe some range-specific strength. Surface EMG and recruitment might be something we pull on as well. What if we look at motor control and coordination? If we take a look at some of the underlying contributors, all of these things here could also lead to braking deficits or propulsive deficits. And for all of these contributors, we want to have some subsets of confirmatory insights to dictate whether or not there's some stuff that we want to address. So it could be something like tibial rotation control. We might take a look at some of Romain's tests where we're looking at metatarsophalangeal flexion torque, ankle inversion and eversion to take a look at that rear foot stabilization. And from there, he has some really good relative strength benchmarks and metrics that are available to us to kind of live outside of the world of asymmetry and start to benchmark these outputs towards norms and also to output and metrics that are adjusted for body mass. We might take a look at segmental sequencing and how they're looking through the extensors, whether it be quadricep strength, hip extension strength, or calf strength. Or we might dive into coach's eye, where we're taking a look at how they're coupling the extensors and the sagittal plane through these low-level drills. Or we might in turn tie it to high-intensity actions and take a look at how they're actually timing those extensors through something like acceleration or max velocity running. And then if we take a look at neuromuscular strategy, we're going to have contributors for that as well. Whether it be yielding, amortization, eccentric quadriceps RFD, concentric power. We're going to want confirmatory insights. We're going to look at different metrics to see whether or not these things may be at play from a neuromuscular standpoint. And we also have our waveform analysis that we'll take a look at as well, which will help orient us where to look. And then through things like Vald's MSK calculators, we can actually, from a neuromuscular standpoint, get these key ratio calculations. So we could calculate through a counter movement jump and an isometric mid-thigh pull something like dynamic strength index, or through a counter movement jump and squat jump something like eccentric utilization ratio. And through this, we can start to actually create these matrices or profiles for our athlete where it's going to tell us whether our athlete is more force dominant or more ballistic, how they're utilizing that elastic system. And really, although it's not going to inform athlete potential, it can help inform potential training emphasis and allow us to pull on more force dominant drills or more ballistic drills or more plyometric drills, depending on where our athlete might skew to. And the context of the sport, obviously, as well. Different positions are going to require different qualities, and we don't want to shift the athlete into a quadrant that's potentially going to have negative performance implications as well. So in essence, at a high level, this is the reverse engineering pyramid. Okay, so we have obviously our test, our performance determinants, our underlying contributors, and then we're going to have our technology diagnostics that are going to help tease out whether or not these things are at play, and our ratios if we want to pull on them to help kind of influence training emphasis. But there's a massive thing that's missing there, and that's waveform analysis. Because at the end of the day, it's the waveform that's going to tell us where to look, right? Remember, if the video of the jump and us evaluating and some of the drivers is the surface, the waveform is really the fingerprint of that movement signature. So if we bring back up our pyramid and we collapse this and add in waveform analysis, these are the common waveforms that we're going to talk about and that we see typically in our athletes as they go through this ACL rehab journey. So we'll take a look at our athletes with ForceDex Vision. I think it gives us a way to get a phase-specific view from a coach's eye perspective, albeit it's just the frontal plane. We want to get some different planes, some sagittal plane views as well. And then we'll use the Microsoft app to layer in force time, which will tell us 90% of what we need to know. We won't get too complex out of the gates. And on this, we'll take a look at the raw data and use the curve to dictate where we might need to look or what strategy the athlete might be employing. So one of the strategies that we'll see a lot in ACL rehab is poor unweighting. So what we get is that eccentric yielding phase as that athlete starts to drop and unweight. That's really where we get this rise in eccentric force and eccentric power, and that's where the onset of EMG activity is from the hip and ankle. This phase is really useful in ACL rehab to characterize movement strategy. And again, just like the shallow end earlier, it shows just their ability or their willingness to unweight and deal with the impulses required for deceleration. Okay, so poor unweighting is what we'll see a lot early on in the ACL process. And we'll just see a limb. You can see an orange here for Avery with her right knee, where we're just lacking that nice U shape that typically occurs when we test them at mid and end stages. We might see these waveforms where the athlete is using these shifting strategies. So here we end up getting basically this early braking increase, but then it returns to normal during deceleration. So it's a really interesting neuromuscular compensatory strategy where this athlete almost preemptively increases force because of their lack of ability to deal with late deceleration demands. So they increase the force early, which helps them deal with those later increases in braking and decel forces that they're going to encounter. Or we might have this shifting asymmetry that switches from one side to the other during the eccentric and concentric phases. And this might point towards neuromuscular coordination or motor control deficits. We might have articular limitations where just in standing, before we even get to the U shape, that athlete, you can see in blue and orange, they're just not together. So either there's an issue there with the force plates or potentially that athlete just can't get their knee extended. So their standing shifted because they're at -10 or lacking 10 degrees of extension. Maybe that's because of arthrofibrosis, maybe it's inhibition, maybe it's a cyclops lesion in the joint, but obviously that's going to vastly affect all subsequent phases as she goes through that counter movement jump. Or she might show us poor eccentric rate of force development, where we just have this really flat slope instead of a steep slope. We might have poor eccentric to concentric transfer, where when we look at the plateau, after it goes through the U shape and the ramp up the mountain, the peak of the mountain, the plateau is really long. instead of short. So there's just this inefficiency through that transfer portion, and likely that comes with longer durations and things like that as well. Or we could have, again, poor eccentric to concentric transfer, but we also have this foot and ankle bimodal strategy. So we get these two peaks to the mountain, but we get the presence of this second peak that's actually higher than the first peak. That could suggest inefficient transfer from the eccentric to concentric phases and potentially inhibition or mechanical inefficiency through the lower limb. And what we end up getting is the EMG analysis shows this strong association between these bimodal late peaks, or that second peak being higher, and a more ankle dominant jump strategy with a high late onset of gastrocnemius. But just because they're using a more ankle dominant strategy does not mean that they're pulling on a more efficient stretch shortening cycle solution. Or we could have these elongated plateaus, where again, it's inefficient eccentric to concentric transfer. And these elongated plateaus could just be a compensatory strategy where the athlete goes into trunk flexion or they excessively swing their leg. And it's really common post-op ACL because they're really trying to unload the knee joint and maximize output like peak power. So what they do is they go into the counter movement jump and they either go into trunk flexion, which increases their contraction time and the time they have to create force, or they swing the back leg backwards and then swing it up vertically. And that orients their center of mass in the consistent direction that the plates are. And if they do that on one side or the other, they're employing different strategies and it may lead to different metrics, different outputs, and again, just some noise in our interpretation and evaluation process. So that's where those testing standards are criteria where the hands are going, our criteria maybe where the trunk or logo is from a cueing standpoint, where they're putting their opposite leg and are they allowed to swing it or not. That starts to come into play in terms of test execution. So now once we understand that we have the test itself, we have our performance determinants, we have our contributors, we're going to use coach's eye or waveform analysis to really tell us where we need to look and where we need to go and what's going on with athlete strategy. And we have these subset of tests diagnostically that we can use as we need to for range of motion, strength, etc. We can really start to figure out what we need to pull on from a performance solution standpoint. So in this case, if we have an articular limitation that we see on the waveform, and when we go in, we take a look at some of the underlying contributors. Well, if this is coming from the knee capsule, or a lack of terminal knee extension or lack of tibial rotation, there's going to be certain buckets that we pull on and drills that we sprinkle in to either the prep or the main block of programming to address those deficits. If we feel like this is more oriented on the foot and ankle complex, and there's some stuff at the talar curl joint and the tarsals and the first ray, we've done our weight-bearing lunge reverse engineering tests to figure that out. We might pull on mobilizations with movement, manipulations, some chronic kind of stretching of the musculotendinous tissue, whatever it might be based on what our confirmatory insights told us. If it's poor on weighting, we may say that this is because of just hesitancy with tibial translation and letting that tibia translate forward. Maybe it's tibial rotation. We know that as they go and flex the knee needs to unlock and the tibia needs to go into internal rotation. They need to dorsiflex at the ankle, they need to yield, and they need to sequence triple flexion and then through propulsion, triple extension. So if we're having that through poor on weighting, and we feel like it's tibial translation or tibial rotation, there's going to be some things that we pull on to address for that athlete with those two contributors. If it's more segmental sequencing or yielding, there's going to be some drills that we pull on for that athlete as well. Bear crawl to pike terminal knee extensions, banded decline squats, Bulgarian pulses, range finders, Bosch steps, Bosch variations. Lots of options we can pull on there. If we have these shifting asymmetries that are at play, whether or not it's this preemptive increase in force to deal with the late decel forces or this shift that goes from the eccentric to concentric phases. Matt Jordan's recent research showed that max concentric strength seems to explain 66% of the variance in lower limb mechanical muscle power across both sexes. And I think it's commonly understood that max strength is the tide that kind of raises all ships. But the relationship between max eccentric strength and braking is a lot more modest. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there's probably this high dependency as well on neuromuscular control and biomechanical movement strategy when it comes to braking ability. And we'll see this all the time with our athletes. Take a look at this strategy here that Avery might employ for us. So we see here through this waveform, do we see that blip there in orange, that little increase in force? What is that? What we end up having here is we have this preemptive rise in force where Avery goes to set up the counter movement jump and she almost raises her center of mass before she free falls into deceleration. Now what this does, it ultimately increases descent distance and ultimately increases her eccentric peak velocity. So what we end up having is this artificially inflated rate of force development slope that occurs from almost dropping into the eccentric phase, and it might not truly be indicative of deceleration abilities for her. So what do we do with that? Well, we pick it up on the waveform, we take a look, oh, that's an interesting strategy we might investigate. Now, a lot of strategies look really good until we expose it to variation, right? What happens if we add speed, load, fatigue? So if we do a body weight counter movement jump, that gives us one time point on the force velocity profile. But what happens if we do a counter movement jump at 30% body weight with dumbbells or a trap bar, or 60% body weight? Well, in this example here, we take a look at how that changes things for Avery, is that what we end up getting is this addition of load in green. This would be a 60% body weight counter movement jump. The additional load provides this constraint to the strategy she's trying to pull on, and it negates this preemptive rise in force and center of mass. And what we end up seeing is this 60% CMJ forces her towards higher levels of eccentric force expression, and it provides a barrier to that preemptive neuromuscular strategy, and it brings these eccentric deceleration deficits to the surface. Okay, so we can start to manipulate test selection and influence strategy via constraints, not just cues. What if she shows us kind of these flat slopes, poor eccentric rate of force development, poor transfer, this kind of long eccentric duration? Remember, not just that shallow end, but that jackhammer and that broken bridge with the transfer. Or she shows us this kind of elongated plateau where she's going into trunk flexion, or she's just inefficiently coupling through that transition between eccentric to concentric. Or maybe she's showing us that late second peak where there's this ankle dominant strategy at play, and she still has inefficient stretch shortening cycle utilization. For all of those, we might have different contributors there at play. It might be first rate push off, eccentric quad strength, amortization. So let's say in this case, we want to deal with eccentric RFD. We feel like with secondary testing, that's what the root cause is, or that's the culprit of what we're seeing in terms of the output or the curve. We're gonna go in and pull on buckets here. Some flywheel drills, some iso holds, pushing and holding isometrics, heavy tempo work, length and state eccentric training, all gonna be great drills to address that eccentric component. We also might have an eccentric plyometric continuum where we bring the athletes through this continuum that includes tall shorts, single leg tall shorts. We add load through trap bar decels. We do Bulgarian split squat drops where we start to split the stance. We move into altitude drops and eventually into kind of some horizontal hop variations, which based on Rula's research shows is quite demanding, especially during the landing phase on the knee joint itself. We also could go into some Enda's drills where we're looking at some of the decel step downs and we're adding overload through the trunk, or we're adding, contralateral coupling in through the kinetic chain, through the trunk and pelvis as we decel through the lower limb, and try to really mimic some of these positions and shapes we're going to get into as they get back to the high intensity actions of sport. When you take a look at some of the Premiership and some of the data coming out of the Champions League, a lot of the runs are happening with an amount of trunk rotation. So adding in some rotary components to these are really going to mimic some of the HIAs and the sporting situations they're going to encounter as they get back into these chaotic environments. If it's amortization, there's going to be great drills to pull on there. Some of those pauses at the bottom, dropping the dumbbells and then going. Some of the depth jumps, and we can let the dumbbells sink us down, or we can drop the dumbbells as we get into the depth and then go into the propulsive phase. All those banded overloaded options are going to be great to suck us down and really make us just be efficient with that eccentric to concentric transfer. And then from a first race standpoint, Romain's got brilliant work to pull on. He's got 2 amazing articles in Sportsmith that have lots of different videos and drill variations. And I believe he has another talk coming up at the time that this gets posted. It might have already happened, but in Paris at the Sportsmith Rehab Conference, where he's revamping some of his frameworks and concepts. But he's got great drills for the forefoot, the midfoot, and the rear foot, and really taking a look at this metatarsophalangeal flexion torque, which we know based on his research has performance implications for the athlete, both with vertical jumps and with high intensity actions, cutting, max velocity, horizontal hopping, and things like that. So in essence, that's our reverse engineering framework, and that's kind of top of mind and going on in our head as we go through the process. Again, we're considering the high intensity actions of sport. We're letting that dictate what qualities we want to look at throughout the entire kinetic chain, and then we're choosing the tests to tease out those qualities at the appropriate times while we consider primary tissue healing. So the tests really serve the qualities and the HIAs and performance. They don't serve our spreadsheet. We don't have protocols in place, and we're always using the waveform as the fingerprint of that movement signature to try to inform us on the strategy that the athlete might be using, the solution that they're trying to provide to the task that we've given them, and where we might need to look in our database from a metric standpoint, or what other subsequent tests we might need to tease out. And then finally, what about the foot and ankle? Right? We talked about really securing these critical anchors to stabilize our journey. If we take a look at the kinetic chain, we know that if these anchors aren't secure, everything above and below could be compromised. And the foot and ankle, it's often kind of thought of as a passenger, but as we saw from a lot of the research, it can be one of the most powerful things to help the athlete not only return to high levels of performance, but also for them to be able to pass our tests that we're going to employ at return to sport. So we're going to need some systems as an organization to address some of these things at the trunk and spinal engine, the hip and pelvis, and the foot and ankle complex. And once we've started to secure these, now we can move them towards faster stretch shortening cycle tasks and know that the foot and ankle complex is going to be huge for absorption and damper. There's going to be this propulsion and transmission and this spring and recoil that takes place for them to really efficiently use their stretch shortening cycle. And through those concepts, Romain's got some brilliant drills again that we can pull on for absorption, for propulsion, for the spring, and for transmission, where we can really start to work on braking, landing, some foot arch gliding and mobility through the midfoot, progressing them towards pogos, multimodal pogos, different planes, frontal, transverse, sagittal plane motions. And then we can progress them to different sorts of plyometrics in different planes and really start to play around with slow, medium, and fast stretch shortening cycle tasks for them. And again, move them along that control to chaos continuum. We don't want to wait too long to start to add in the shapes and postures that they're going to get into when they get back to sport, right? I think to take this phasic approach where plyometrics are at the end, running is at the end, acceleration is at the end in the last phase, and not expose them to that early can make the difference in months in the return to sport process, but also can be the difference between return to sport and return to performance. So if we take these 2 motions here, 2 very safe motions to be doing with just different amounts of intent through the early and mid ACL rehab process. And if we take this video of Avery accelerating and we break it down into a bit of a kinogram, and we take a look at some of the shapes and ranges she's in at the trunk, at the hip, at the knee, and the foot and ankle, well, those vastly resemble the shapes and ranges that we're in with some of these drills. If we take a look at something like this change of direction isometric, and then we take a look at a cut that Avery gives us, what we can start to see is if we analyze the shapes and postures she's in again at the trunk, hip, knee, and foot and ankle, well, now they start to resemble some of the shapes and postures that she's actually in that drill. So again, really understanding the high intensity actions of sport, what qualities make up efficiency with those actions, and being able to reverse engineer not just tests to tease out the status of those qualities, but also be able to tease out what drill selection we can pull on to put an athlete safely early into those shapes and postures and have them create some efforts and intent and coach them through that in an isometric, either pushing or holding standpoint, really creates this early exposure from a neuromuscular coordination standpoint. And you'll be able to reap the benefits in spades as we get back to the return to sport process. And again, I truly believe can be a massive low-hanging fruit in the difference between return to sport and return to performance. And really at the end of the day, when we bring cohesion to our systems and we understand how strategy shapes output, we can recognize these common patterns and phenotypes. We know how to reverse engineer the path forward through the tests that we're selecting, and we secure our critical anchors early. That's when we can really stop chasing numbers and we can actually start guiding our athletes. Because at the end of the day, as we bring them through hypertrophy, strength, power, plyometrics, early on that neuromuscular coordination is really going to underpin higher rates of force expression. And when we have the movement competency, then we can start to layer on the qualities that are going to prepare them for the high demands of sport. We restore mass, max strength, eccentric qualities, explosiveness, reactive strength. We can hit these key milestones along the way, and we're going to have criteria for these milestones. And some of those criteria are going to include vertical jumps, right? But we're going to have systems to make sure that we're really confident that our athletes are ready to return to these key functional tasks. And we're going to work them through each milestone as they go through the process. And then we can get into coach's eye. And we don't want to forget this. We don't want to forget coach's eye in terms of waveform and interpretation, but also just taking a look at key motions. We need to understand what good gait looks like. We need to understand what we need to see with acceleration through all the key landmarks, through max velocity, through cutting and evasion. If we can't list off what we would like to see, who are we to be evaluating that on the client? If we can't hang our hat on what good is, we shouldn't be commenting on deficiencies and things like that, right? So coach's eye remains key, and data and analytics should never replace our autonomy or our clinical decision-making power. It should support and augment it. So we need to be able to use coach's eye to break down early things like gait, step down, stairs, and then we can move into things like acceleration, max velocity, and then change of direction, deceleration, and evasion. And through all of this, being able to coach them through these qualities and these high intensity actions of sport, we're going to be able to see the force time curve evolve. And their efficiency for the task is also going to evolve. And what we're going to see is really an evolution in the performance of their high intensity actions. With this holistic approach, we can really ensure that we're bringing the athlete's journey full circle. From one of the darkest times that they've likely encountered, especially in 2026 when a lot of athletes are not multi-sport athletes, they didn't just lose their sport. A lot of the time they've lost their team and their entire social circle. So we're there to support them during those early days. We can get them off the table out into the gym early to make sure that they're surrounded by peers who can support them through their process. We can use dual force plates to measure quiet standing, balance, squat, and single leg squats, which are going to be massive pillars to our vertical jumps, our counter movement jumps, our drop jumps. And we can really employ this performance rehab process where we use data to keep us in check. It really helps us know whether or not we're choosing the right stimulus or whether our client's getting the adaptations. And we're not just another person with an opinion. And really at the end of the day, with our egos at the door, this is what really helps refine our programming too, because we start to learn what drills and what cues are going to work for our athletes and what's truly getting the adaptations that we set out to get at the beginning of the block. Then we can move into vertical jump tests, and then we can move into the treatment room where we can take a look at strategy, and by understanding it ourselves, and again, force time being 90% of what we need to understand, we can actually start to create some vision for the athlete and outline for them the shapes and what those shapes mean, what ranges of motion they're in during those shapes, and how that's going to link and tie to sport. That's how we bring the athlete's journey full circle. That's how we don't just return them to sport, we return them to performance.
Crossed up, long post, headed through, it's in! It's in! Right when they needed it most! The bouncer gets past McKenna Jane, and the Dinos have the opening goal.
Hey guys, Trav here. Thanks so much for spending the last 60 minutes or so with me. Hopefully there was lots of value there and you guys have some tangible things you can take into your practice. I just wanted to kind of say that this can seem like a lot, And it's important to know that these frameworks and systems are the accumulation of 4 to 5 years of work. Some of these are on the 4th, 5th, 6th iterations. Creating stuff like this, whether it be standards or things for cohesion in your own practice or your clinics, can seem daunting. But at some point, you need to just put pen to paper and stop trying to create this perfect architecture the first time. When it's 80% of the way there, launching it is never detrimental. It allows you to put it into action, see what works, what doesn't work. And that's really the first step in coming up with this 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th iterations. So put pen to paper, figure out if you leave from here knowing that you have some stuff to take a look at in terms of force time for CMJ and drop jump. These are the common phenotypes. These are the common shapes and waveforms that I might see. Here's some buckets of solutions. And these are things that are going on in my head. But I'm going to put pen to paper and get them out so that if I'm mentoring somebody, I can explain my process. If I have a team underneath me, I have compelling visuals to show them to try to create cohesion across a standard. And maybe you identified, these are some things that we're not doing as an organization. I didn't realize how much they could be influencing the numbers that we get. And maybe we are comparing apples to oranges. And again, we've been influenced massively by giants whose shoulders we're standing on. A lot of this, you obviously saw their themes and research emerging throughout my thought process, and they've been massively influential to my practice and how I navigate thinking about movement and thinking about data and insights and interpretation. So hopefully sharing that and how I've utilized that in practice from a practical standpoint and applied that to an athlete is beneficial. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. And thanks so much for trusting us and giving us your time, obviously, to go through this and stay in touch.